That was good morning. And I even wrote it because it was really important for me to say.
You have to talk to the microphone. No?
So what I said is I even wrote it because it was really important for me to say. Yesterday I went back to the room and I felt like so storm, like it's full with like emotions and questions and idea, and I just took the night. I even went out with you, just like sitting and processing. For me, from like a theater person to be here in the past 3 days, it's extraordinary. And I really want to thank Boaz and Avi and Stefan and Oshrat and Miriam for arranging it. It's so productive and pleasant to be here and to connect with you, extraordinary people. So just to really thank. And in addition to all the discussions and the various approaches that we discussed this morning, I would like to offer another perspective on the future of testimony, this time from a theater point of view. And I know we experienced this week some theater performances, which is great for my discussion. So in my current doctoral project in theater studies, I am examining the ways in which Holocaust memory is staged in 21st century Israeli theater. When I look at Holocaust theater in Israel in the past 20 years, to oversimplify, my main finding is that Holocaust theater in 21st century Israel is not about the Holocaust. So, what it is about? Among the hundreds of plays and theatrical projects related to the Holocaust I have listed, many deals with the changes in Holocaust memory as it transformed from one generation to another, and some of them directly address the question of the future of testimony. As we all experienced this week, theater can serve both as a thoughtful yet challenging educational platform to transmit the memory and a profound therapeutical tool in helping to confront the trauma. Although theater can do both, I would like to offer a different perspective that utilizes the theater not as a tool to transmit or confront the memory, but rather as an arena to reflect on the way memory is transmitted. In the current transition into what Diana Popesco refers to as post-witness era, the shift from living memory, first-hand oral testimony, to mediated memory, a second-hand form of representation, is unavoidable. One of the challenges in this transition is that while the details of the story are preserved, the embodied action of telling is being lost together with the original teller. Considering that the loss is not of knowledge written or recorded, but of a physical presence, a living performative act, I ask, how can theater, with its unique oral and embodiment techniques, help us to understand this delicate transition? So to discuss this question, I will present today two theatrical pieces that are quite challenging. They demand our attention as they replicate and deconstruct the action of giving testimony. In both theatrical pieces, an actor played the role of a Holocaust survivor who gave testimony in the common routine format that we also experienced this week, alone, in a frontal manner, either in front of a group or in a recorded interview session. In both cases, almost after an hour of hearing the story of the survivors, in the last minutes of the performances, the actors removed their costumes and revealed their actual identities as the second and third generation of the Holocaust. Why to replicate the testimony when we have recorded and even digital interactive testimonies? And furthermore, after doing so, why to deconstruct it? What did these performative acts add to our discussion regarding the future of the testimony? So I will first present the performances, and then I will discuss the performative act of replication and deconstruction, and let's see what the play has to say. So the first play is Mania, a performative testimony by Shai Kadimi. The play follows the first and final testament of Mania Horowitz, a 95-year-old survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, widow, mother of two, resident of Tel Aviv, Israel. This is who the audience thinks they are going to meet when they come to hear Mania's testimony. The performative testimony begins when Mania enters the room, sits down very slowly, and after long moments does not utter a word. We hear only the sounds of silence. When Manya finally begins to speak, the first thing she says is, "For a long time, I had not wanted to talk. I know many who have told their stories to high school students or army soldiers, but I didn't want to. I never agreed. It is hard, very hard." Then, shaken, in between long moments of silence, she shares fragments of the horror of her days at Block 10 in Auschwitz-Birkenau. After sharing a complicated memory, suddenly she stops and says, "I'm done. I can't anymore." She stands up, apologizes, and exits the stage. After she exits, a 4-minute video is played, showing the process of Kadimi, a young male actor, as he prepares for his role, applying makeup, donning in bodysuit, and becoming Manya, the survivor who just testified. At the end of the video, Kadimi, the actor that in the meanwhile took off Manya's costume, returned to the stage as himself and retell the audience the stories behind Manya, who characterizes his combination of 4 Holocaust survivors, Ada Leichman, Malka Israel, Esther Hershkovitz, and Ruth Eliaz. Kadimi explains his connection to these survivors and his motives in creating the play as a way to keep the memory alive. The second performance is entitled Grandma Varda Saloon, written by Dudi Ochana and performed by Anat Atzmon. The play presents the first testimony of Varda Tzipori, a 95-year-old survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, resident of Tel Aviv. After decades of refusing to talk about what happened to her there, Varda agreed to her pleas. Varda agreed to her daughter's plea and allowed the Yad Vashem film crew to come to her living room and collect her testimony. The film crew are not on stage, but we can observe their interaction between them through her response. The play begins when Varda asks the crew how much time it will take. To tell you the truth, I want to be done with it as soon as possible. I never really wanted to talk, and I don't want to do it. I do it also now. But after a long preparations and many excuses, when she finally begins to talk, her testimony becomes quite different from what the film crew had expected or used to hear. Instead of talking about the life she created, about what happened to her in the Holocaust, she insists to talk about the life she created in Tel Aviv after the war, her nightlife, and the tattoo salon she has run for many years. When the crew insists on hearing her experiences during the war, she simply replies that it was bad, and keep talking about her life she created after surviving the war, and the tattoos that cover her body, and also her complex relationship with her daughter, that always wanted to hear what happened there. The play's twist when Varda described a terrorist attack that happened in Tel Aviv. At that moment, her voice changes, and then suddenly she removes what turns out to be a wig, and a long brown hair is revealed, exposing a much younger woman that turns out to be none other than Varda's daughter, Ruti. Ruti confesses her identity and explains to the crew that her mother died without telling her story, and begs that they will accept the testimony of her mother from her. She explains that only after her mother's death did she realize that her mother had never told her story in words, but rather expressed it through the artistic expression on the tattoos she had on her body. I see your faces, and I know, hold on. These performances are very tricky, because testimony is, of course, testimony, oral or written, is a legal term that plays a central yet complex role in finding out the truth. Telling a first-hand testimony by someone who didn't experience or witness what he or she is testifying about is downright prejudice. Staging fake characters portraying survivors who testify about a horror that they endured, and then also revealing the fact that they are mere imposters, it's outrageous. But given that these performances were not created in order to question nor to deny the Holocaust, and taking into account that their creators are second and third generation of the Holocaust, once again I ask, why replicate the testimony? And why deconstruct it? What does this performative act offer to our discussion regarding the Holocaust? So let's look closer. Interestingly, both performances feature dramatic persona who are very similar. Both of the characters are women who were born in Poland, survived Auschwitz, currently live in Tel Aviv, and even look quite the same. They both have short hair and wear glasses, earring, jacket, and a shawl. On top of this similarity, in both performances, the 95-year-old survivor gives testimony for their first time in their lives. These dramatic facts demand us to recognize the significant importance of this testimony and to carefully examine the theatrical replication of the testimony, to analyze its component, and to seriously contemplate what will be missed in its absence. Unlike in-person project that conveys the details of the stories, even though we've changed it a little bit, these plays present both the setting and the components of the testimony itself. Therefore, in these plays, we can recognize many of the themes regarding testimony that we have discussed this week. Firstly, performing the survivor's silence, along with the broken language, tonality, intonation, repetitive manners and gestures that confirms the inability of the language to fully communicate the trauma. Following this observation, these performances demonstrate the notion of testimony as an ethical performative act that emphasizes the centrality of the experienced body that contains the traumatic event. Secondly, in recreating the testimony setting, these performances shed light on the testimony as an interaction, acknowledging the importance of both listener and the contents in shaping the testimony. Third, the interaction with the audience or with the testimony collectors expose the expectations from the survivor to testify and to provide specific answers to specific topic that we have been conditioning to expect. These expectations point out the critical role the testimonies have become in transmitting the memories of the Holocaust. These performances also directly address the relationship with the following generation and express the need they have to carry the memory and their challenges in doing so. If to postulate the testimony is embodied in the body, then we can understand the need of the actors to replicate the testimony. And if we postulate that testimony is a central tool in transmitting the memory, we can understand the actor's need to follow the beaten path and to replicate the testimony, both as a social expectation and as an ethical action. But then, why to deconstruct it? So, in the ending moments of the play, the testimony is deconstructed and the upcoming generations are being revealed. Although in both cases these moments are only a short portion of the performance, I see them as the central part of it. Who are the next generation? In contrast to the similarity in the characters of the survivor, the identity of the actors are very different. In the first play, Mania is Shai Kadimi. Mania was written and acted by Shai Kadimi, which is a Moroccan descent who was brought up in a household where Holocaust was not part of his family story. His connection to the Holocaust is rooted from his childhood experiences in his hometown, Ramat Gan, near Tel Aviv, where he was surrounded by neighbors and teachers who were survivors. Therefore, he is culturally considered as a third generation to the Holocaust. Kadimi has been performing the play Mania over the last 24 years, and just by tracking the changes of his performance, we can learn a lot about the evolution of Holocaust memory in Israel. Shai's first performance was when he was in 12th grade and convinced his school principal to add to the school Holocaust Remember Day informal ceremony a monologue based on an actual stories of the Holocaust survivor he knew from his neighborhood. His idea was to stage the performance as a testimony so his fellow student could relate to the personal story that will stick to them. A few years later, as a student in a performing arts school, he modified the play and performed it in a theater stage designed as a home of an Holocaust survivor. In this intimate space, he hosts the audience and share her story. This play ends when Mania perishes on the stage as she's finishing telling her story. After a couple of years, educational programs started to invite Kadimi to perform the play as a substitute to the live meeting with Holocaust survivors that became quite challenging to arrange. Since this meeting took place outside of a theatrical stage, the performances created a simulation problem, as the audience were under the impression that they really meet with a genuine survivor. Therefore, Kadimi added the epilogue, where he reveals his character, interacts with the audience, and has a conversation about the play. As the years went by, the epilogue evolved and included stories about members of the audience who saw the plays and shared their story with him, and eventually the epilogue became equal in time to the testimony itself, and sometimes even longer. The focus on the play shifted from the stories of the survivors to Kadimi's own story, and then to the stories of the various members of the audience. Like in Mania, Varda is a fictional character that is based on a real woman, in this case the Moroccan-born grandmother of the playwright Dudi Ochana, that, as he claimed, she's not a Holocaust survivor, but she's a survivor of many other things. Like Kadimi, Ochana was born and bred to a non-Holocaust survivor family. But unlike Kadimi, Ochana grew up in Bet Shean, a small town in the north of Israel whose population were mainly Jews of North Africa descendants who had little or no direct connection with the Holocaust. Ochana, exposed to the Holocaust, was only through graphic photographs and movies that were screened on the television and at his school in the Holocaust Remembrance Day. The idea of Varda character came to him when he saw a couple of Holocaust survivors celebrating and toasting l'chaim, cheers, on Yom HaShoah. The individual celebration of life, in contrast to the agenda of the day of national mourning, contradicted the image that he had on Holocaust survivors, which in turn inspired him to create and write this play. Unlike Mania, the play Grandma Varda Saloon takes place on a theater stage, and the audience can easily recognize the famous Israeli actors Anat Atzmon. Atzmon is a descendant of two Holocaust survivors and considered as second generation to the Holocaust. In the play, Atzmon actually plays the role of what she is in real life, a second generation who also grew up without knowing her parents' story. Despite this fact, the play was criticized, and the committee of the theater festival asked Ochana, the playwright, to change the ending so Varda will be the one to tell her story and not her daughter. Also, Shmulik Atzmon, a known actor and Anat's father, who as mentioned is on Holocaust survivors, told me that after seeing the play, he felt that it was very problematic that the play seems to advocate the people who weren't there had the rights to testify on what happened there. He told me that I wanted to leave the play knowing that this was the way Varda was, because only one that experienced that is the one that can transmit those stories. Ochana felt that he couldn't do and couldn't change the play since it was so important for him to show that the story is not only Varda's stories, but also Ruti's story. So, if only those who were there can tell the story, but those who were there are no longer be with us. And if the central way to transmit the memory nowadays is through testimony, but replicating the testimony is very problematic, we're kind of stuck. If we'll circle back to the leading question, how does theater help us to understand this delicate shift from living memory to the mediated memory? What does theater have to offer to the discussion of the future of testimony? I argue that although we have amazing tools to preserve testimony, either via digital means or through the medium of theater that allows us to step into the shoes of the survivor, or even in Varda case, to get under the skin in the transition to the post-witness era, these performances provoke us to rethink the notion of testimony in regards to Holocaust memory. To explain this claim, I would like to utilize the classic dichotomy between history and memory. History as the factual knowledge of the past, and memory as the ever-changing meanings of the past to the present. And based on that, to ask, where do testimonies belong? Testimony, on one hand, are based on memory, and as discussed and showed, are constantly open to changes. On the other hand, in a world without living witnesses, the dynamic nature of living memory may no longer apply. The performances I examine illuminate the need to understand and determine the dynamic nature of memory, rooted not only in facts, but also in greater extent in meanings. It is for that reason that I want to suggest that in the post-witness era, we define testimony as history. Therefore, as a tool to transmit the memory, testimony has no future. Testimony should remain a precious component in historical research and should be kept under touch so we can also play its in the political sphere. We must find other ways of memory, as we currently do for so many other historical events. So to conclude, for many political, social, historical, and philosophical reasons, testimony became a main tool to transmit the memory of the Holocaust. Despite the fact that the testimony conversation offers alternative models that have transformed testimony from a presentation of objective truth to a moral act, in the way I see it, thinking in terms of testimony and the use of term witness or secondary witness is limiting the discussion to the first generation that had actually experienced the event with their own body. Talking in terms of testimony does not and cannot include the following generation. The theater stage then reflects clearly on the need to shift the center of the memory to expand the authentic living memory from the original source, the witnesses, to the following generations, the memory carrier. In doing so, the memory carrier should not attempt to be an authentic, authoritative copy, but rather a new original. These plays are an example of how Holocaust theater in 21st century Israel is not about the Holocaust, it's about the memory and its roles in the memory carrier identity. And today I tried to touch upon the challenges and but in other performances in my research, I also explore the opportunity of this shift. And I'm so eagerly waiting to hear your thoughts and critiques and questions. Thank you.